Imagine trying to read a long, complicated sentence in French, memorize its entire meaning in your head as a single mental snapshot, and then write out the English translation purely from that snapshot, without ever glancing back at the original. That is essentially what the dominant neural translation systems of 2014 were being asked to do. And as you might guess, they started to crack under the strain when sentences got long. The paper we're discussing today, by Bahdanau, Cho, and Bengio, introduced an elegant fix to this problem, and in doing so planted the seed for what would become one of the most important ideas in modern deep learning: attention. Let's set the stage. Neural machine translation was a fresh idea at the time. Instead of the traditional approach, called phrase-based statistical machine translation, which stitched together many separately tuned components like phrase tables, language models, and reordering models, the neural approach aimed for something radically simpler: a single neural network, trained end-to-end, that reads a source sentence and outputs a translation. The standard architecture was the encoder-decoder, where one recurrent neural network, the encoder, reads the source sentence word by word and compresses everything it has seen into a single fixed-length vector. And then a second recurrent network, the decoder, takes that vector and unrolls it into the target sentence one word at a time. It's a beautiful idea in principle, but the bottleneck is obvious in hindsight. You're forcing the entire meaning of a sentence, whether it's 5 words or 50, through a single fixed-size representation. Prior empirical work had already shown that translation quality degrades sharply as input sentences get longer, which is exactly what you'd expect when you're trying to pour more and more water into a glass that doesn't grow. The author's insight is to remove that bottleneck entirely. Instead of compressing the source sentence into one vector, they let the encoder produce a sequence of vectors, one per source word, and then they let the decoder, at every step of generating the translation, decide which of those source vectors to look at. Think of it like a human translator working with the source sentence laid out on the desk in front of them, glancing back to specific words as they write each word of the translation, rather than memorizing the whole sentence and then writing from memory. Now let's get into how this actually works. The encoder is a bidirectional recurrent neural network. One RNN reads the sentence left to right, producing a sequence of forward hidden states, and another reads it right to left, producing backward hidden states. For each source word, they concatenate the forward and backward states at that position to form what they call an annotation. Because of how RNNs tend to emphasize recent inputs, each annotation ends up being a representation centered on its corresponding word, but informed by context from both directions. So instead of one summary vector for the whole sentence, you have one rich contextual vector per word. The decoder is where the magic happens. When generating the next target word, the decoder maintains its own hidden state, which tracks what has been translated so far. At each step, before producing the next word, it computes a context vector tailored specifically to that moment. It does this by taking a weighted sum of all the source annotations, where the weights reflect how relevant each source word is to producing the current target word. Those weights come from what the authors call an alignment model, which is just a small feed-forward neural network that takes the decoder's previous hidden state and a source annotation and outputs a score for how well they match. They run this scoring function over every source position, then pass all the scores through a softmax to turn them into a probability distribution. That distribution is what tells the decoder where to focus. The weighted sum of annotations, using those probabilities as weights, becomes the context vector that feeds into generating the next word. The crucial design choice here is that the alignment is soft, not hard. A hard alignment would force the model to pick one source word to attend to, which would make the whole thing non-differentiable and require special training tricks. A soft alignment, by contrast, lets the model spread its attention across multiple source words with continuous weights, which means gradients flow cleanly through the entire system and the alignment model gets trained jointly with everything else, purely from the signal of producing correct translations. There are no explicit alignment labels. The model just figures out, on its own, what to attend to. The experimental results validated the hypothesis sharply. On English to French translation, using the WMT 2014 dataset, they compared their new model, called RNN Search, against the standard encoder-decoder baseline, called RNN NCDEC. Both were trained in two variants, one on sentences up to 30 words long and one up to 50. The headline numbers tell a clear story. On sentences without unknown words, RNN Search 50 hit a BLU score of about 34, while the encoder-decoder baseline at the same sentence length cap got only about 27. With longer training, RNN Search reached about 36, essentially matching the established phrase-based Moses system at 35.6, which is remarkable given that Moses used an additional 418 million words of monolingual data that the neural models didn't have access to. Even more telling was how the two models behaved as sentences got longer. The baseline encoder-decoder's quality collapsed past about 30 words, while RNN Search held steady all the way out to 50 words and beyond. The qualitative analysis is equally compelling. Because the attention weights are explicit, you can visualize them as a matrix showing which source words the model looked at when generating each target word. The resulting alignments look linguistically sensible. For mostly monotonic translations, you see a strong diagonal. But when English and French diverge in word order, like the phrase European Economic Area becoming Zone économique européenne, the attention map jumps around in exactly the way a human translator would, looking ahead to area first to produce zone, then backing up to handle the modifiers. The soft alignment also handles tricky one-to-many cases gracefully. To translate the English "the" into French, you need to know the gender and number of the following noun, and the model naturally learns to attend to both the and the next word when producing the French article. Now for the limitations and the broader perspective. The authors are upfront that handling rare and unknown words remains a weakness, since they used a vocabulary of only 30,000 words and mapped everything else to an unknown token. There's also a computational concern. Computing attention weights over every source word for every target word is quadratic in sentence length, which is fine for translation where sentences are typically 15 to 40 words but could become a real bottleneck for longer documents. And while the attention maps look interpretable, that interpretability is somewhat a happy accident of the architecture, not a guarantee that the model is reasoning the way we think it is. Looking forward, the implications of this paper turned out to be enormous, though probably larger than even the authors anticipated. The core idea that a model can learn to dynamically attend to different parts of its input depending on context became the foundation for the transformer architecture 3 years later, which itself became the foundation for essentially every large language model we use today. This paper is, in many ways, the quiet origin point of the attention revolution. Now let's walk through some questions you might have after hearing all of this. First question, why does soft attention work so much better than just making the encoder vector bigger? You might think, sure, a fixed vector is limiting, but couldn't you just use a much larger one? The problem is that a bigger vector still has to encode everything in advance before the decoder knows what it needs. Soft attention is fundamentally different because it defers the question of what's important until decoding time, when the model has context about which target word it's about to produce. It's the difference between packing for a trip without knowing where you're going versus being able to reach back into your closet at any moment. Second question, How does the alignment model learn to produce sensible alignments without any explicit supervision on alignment? This is the elegant part. There's no alignment label in the training data, just source-target sentence pairs. But because the alignment weights determine which annotations the decoder gets to see, and because the whole system is trained to maximize the probability of producing the correct translation, any attention pattern that helps produce better translations will get reinforced through backpropagation. The model essentially discovers that attending to relevant source words helps it predict the right target words, so it learns to do that on its own. Third question. If attention is computed over every source word for every target word, doesn't that get expensive? Yes, and this is a real concern. The cost scales as the product of the source length and target length, which for translation of short sentences is totally fine, but becomes a problem for longer sequences. This is one reason that, in later work, people developed techniques like sparse attention, local attention windows, and various efficiency tricks. For the original use case of sentence-level translation, though, the cost was manageable and the quality gains more than justified it. To bring this back to large-scale recommendation systems, the soft attention mechanism introduced here maps surprisingly directly onto problems we face when serving recommendations to hundreds of millions of users. Consider user modeling. A user's history might contain thousands of interactions, but only a small subset is relevant to predicting whether they'll engage with a particular candidate item. Rather than compressing the entire history into a fixed user embedding, which is the recommendation analog of the encoder-decoder bottleneck, you can use attention to let the model dynamically select which past interactions matter most for the current candidate. This is exactly what production systems like target attention and click-through rate models do, and the lineage traces straight back to this paper. The same idea extends to candidate ranking and retrieval. When ranking a candidate item, attention can dynamically weight different aspects of user context, like recent clicks, long-term preferences, or session signals, based on the candidate itself. For real-time serving, the practical lesson is that you don't always need to pre-compute everything into a single fixed representation. Sometimes deferring the compression until you know the query allows for much richer modeling at modest additional cost. The harder challenge in recommendation, just like in translation, is the quadratic cost when histories or candidate sets get large, which is why techniques like attention over learned summaries, hierarchical attention, and approximate nearest neighbor retrieval all play crucial roles in making these ideas work at web scale.